When two lines are cut by a transversal, 8 angles are created. And there's different kinds of angles amongst those angles, like 1 and 5 are corresponding angles, and 1 and 8 are alternate exterior angles, and 2 and 7 are alternate interior angles, and 2 and 5 are consecutive interior angles. Now, if those lines that are cut by a transversal are parallel, we have a bunch more information that's true. If S and R are parallel, I'm going to mark them parallel with these two arrow symbols, then I have a bunch more ways that the kinds of angles are related to each other. If I look at these 4 angles and I slide those 4 angles across my transversal, 1 is going to take up the exact same amount of space as 5. So 1 and 5 are going to be congruent. So if my lines are parallel, if S is parallel to R, then all my corresponding angles will be congruent. Angle 1 will be congruent to angle 5. Angle 2 will be congruent to angle 6. Angle 4 will be congruent to angle 7. And angle 3 will be congruent to angle 8. Now, if these lines aren't parallel, I can't conclude this. I'll still have corresponding angles, they just won't be congruent. Once my lines are parallel, then I can conclude that my corresponding angles are congruent. If I look at angle 2 and angle 7, they're alternate interior angles. If I slide these 4 angles down, 2 is going to take the place of 6. And 7 and 6 are vertical, so they're congruent. So 2 is congruent to 6, and 7 is congruent to 6. That means that 2 is congruent to 7. So if my lines are parallel, S is parallel to R, then my alternate interior angles will be congruent. Angle 2 will be congruent to angle 7. And angle 3 will be congruent to angle 5. I can do the same thing with my alternate exterior angles, like 4 and 6. If I slide these angles down, 4 and 7 will be congruent, and 6 and 7 are vertical, so they're congruent. So 4 is congruent to 7, and 6 is congruent to 7, so 4 and 6 have to also be congruent. So my alternate exterior angles, angle 4 and angle 6, and angle 1 and angle 8 will be congruent. And finally, the consecutive interior angles. 2 and 5 are consecutive interior angles. If I slide these 4 angles down, 2 will take the place of 6. And if I look, 5 and 6 form a linear pair, so they're supplementary. And 2 and 6 are congruent. So if 5 and 6 are supplementary, and 2 and 6 are congruent, 2 and 5 have to be supplementary also. If my lines are parallel, then the measure of angle 2 plus the measure of angle 5, my consecutive interior angles, will give me 180 degrees. I can do that same thing with my other pair of consecutive interior angles, 3 and 7. Let's use these postulates and theorems to do some algebra. I'm told that W is parallel to X, so I'm going to mark that. I'm also told that Y is parallel to Z. Now, all of these just have one arrow mark, so that means that they're all parallel to each other. So I want to separate this pair of parallel lines from this pair of parallel lines. To do that, I'm going to use 2 two parallel line arrows. Next, I need to identify the kinds of angles that I have. So if I look, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 angles. These two angles form a linear pair. They're supplementary. These two angles are alternate exterior angles. And these two angles are consecutive interior angles. Next, I need to set up my equations. Well, I have three different equations that I can set up. If I look, these two angles right here form a linear pair. Since these two form a linear pair, they're supplementary. So 2a minus 6 degrees plus b has to equal 180 degrees. Because they form a linear pair, they're supplementary. I also know that this angle and this angle are alternate exterior angles. They have transversals Z and parallel lines W and X. And since W and X are parallel, my alternate exterior angles will be congruent. And since they're congruent, they're going to be equal to each other. 2a minus 6 has to equal a plus 68 degrees. And that's because they are alternate exterior angles, which means that they have to be congruent. And the third equation that I can set up, these two angles here and here have transversal W, and they're between Y and Z. And Y and Z are parallel, so these two consecutive interior angles have to be supplementary. 4b minus 10 degrees plus b has to equal 180 degrees. And that's because those two angles are consecutive interior. And consecutive interior angles will be supplementary. So I have three different equations to solve from, or to choose from. And I want to pick one that solves for A. If I look at my first equation, I have an A and a B. Well, no matter what I do, I'm going to always have an A and a B. So instead, I'm going to go to the equation that only has A in it. So I'm going to start with 2a minus 6 and set it equal to a plus 68. Now I can solve for A. Add 6 degrees to both sides, and I'm left with A equals 74 degrees. I can solve for B. To solve for B, this equation involves B, but it also has an A, which means that I don't want to pick that first equation. And the second equation, solve for A, I'm going to hop to that third equation. These two angles were consecutive interior, so they were supplementary, so 4b minus 10 degrees plus b had to equal 180 degrees. Solve for B. Combine my like terms. Undo what's happening to B. And isolate B. 190 divided by 5 is 38 degrees. Now I can check my answer. I can plug A and B back in to figure out how big each angle is. Well, this angle's 2 A's minus 6. So if I have 2 A's, I have two 74s minus 6. So this angle is 142 degrees. This angle is A plus 68. It's 74 plus 68. So it's also 142 degrees, which makes sense because these two angles are alternate exterior, so they had to be congruent. This angle is 4b's minus 10. So I have 4 38ths minus 10. It's also 142. Well, if I look, these two angles happen to be alternate interior angles between y and z. So they should be congruent to each other. And this angle is just b big. It's 38 degrees big. Well, if I look, these two angles should be supplementary. Let's check that. 142 plus 38. They are supplementary, so I know I've done all my math correctly.